And welcome to everyone on the line. I hope we're finding you well and that you and your families continue to stay healthy and safe. We're grateful to have you joining us for today's Fighting Hate from Home webinar, the Abraham Accord, the significance of this historic peace agreement between the UAE and Israel. For today's call, ADL CEO and National Director Jonathan Greenblatt will be speaking with one of the main architects of the recent peace agreement, His Excellency Ambassador Yousef Al-Otaiba of the United Arab Emirates to the United States of America. Ambassador Al-Otaiba courageously challenged taboos this June when he appealed directly to the Israeli public through an op-ed published in an Israeli newspaper. He wrote about risks of annexation and benefits of normalization. He helped initiate and negotiate this accord, and he recently followed it up with an op-ed in the Israeli press that sent the message, Shalom, Salam, and welcome to the neighborhood. The ambassador took up his post in Washington in 2008. In this role, he has significantly expanded bilateral security and economic cooperation, as well as building a warm and inclusive relationship with the Jewish American community. For instance, resulting in an unprecedented delegation from the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish American Organizations to Abu Dhabi and Dubai in 2018. We are honored to be joined by His Excellency the Ambassador, and it is my pleasure to turn the call over to Jonathan. Jonathan, unfortunately, you're on mute.
Great. Thank you, Deb. And I want to say hello to everyone and welcome folks who are joining us and wish those who are celebrating Shana Tova. Israel and the United Arab Emirates made history last month, agreeing to work towards fully normalizing relations and even announcing plans for potential cooperation across civil fields and multiple spheres between the two most technologically innovative countries in the region. And as part of this accords, the Israeli government agreed to suspend its plans to declaring sovereignty over territory in the West Bank. By announcing this accord, the UAE became the first Arab country in over 2 decades to recognize the Jewish state. And unlike Israel's past peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, this peace appears to be on track to potentially become the first warm peace between Israel and an Arab nation, driven not by politics at the top or mutual security considerations, although those are important, but by people-to-people partnerships, commercial, cultural, touristic, etc. Israel and the UAE formalized these understandings with a treaty of peace, diplomatic relations, and full normalization that was signed just last week on the South Lawn of the White House. They were also joined by the Kingdom of Bahrain. ADL has enjoyed a fruitful relationship with UAE over the years on issues related to fighting bigotry, and I will tell you that I feel fortunate to consider Ambassador Otaiba sort of a counselor and a friend. The day that the agreement was announced back in August, I spoke to him that afternoon. We had a long conversation, in part about the long history that our organization has had with the UAE and about the remarkable leadership that they have shown and that the ambassador has demonstrated in particular. He's been an incredibly constructive interlocutor for our organization whenever we asked the UAE government to consider steps that we thought could be helpful in terms of fighting anti-Semitism in the region or ensuring fair treatment for Israelis at international events hosted by the Emirates. Last year, ADL co-sponsored an event with the embassy, thanks to the ambassador, that engaged on a development that, in retrospect, I believe, was one of the preludes of the historic peace agreement. The UAE's systematic and concrete steps to build tolerance between peoples of different religions, including Jews, and it's not something we at the ADL take for granted. At that event, ADL had the distinct honor of being able to break the news that the Jewish community of the Emirates had appointed my friend, Rabbi Yehuda Sarna of NYU, as its new chief rabbi. And in that installation represents the first chief rabbi to be in place in an Arab country in memory, certainly since the founding of the State of Israel. And now this month, ADL has announced that Rabbi Sarna and I are going to launch a new joint research group for advising the Jewish Council of the Emirates on a range of ADL's educational resources and best practices for houses of worship to secure themselves, as well as provide analysis to the Jewish community to deal and monitor with cyber hate from elsewhere in the region and really help dismantle harmful stereotypes. It is work we could not do without the support of the UAE government, in particular, Ambassador Otaiba. So I'm delighted to be welcoming my friend, the Ambassador, Yusuf Alotaiba, here to our Fighting Hate From Home seminar so that we can hear directly from him, talk more about what happened in the past 6 weeks, and try to get a feeling for where we're headed in the future. Ambassador, welcome this afternoon.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for your support and friendship. We have been talking about these issues for I feel like almost a decade.
Yeah.
And we've been making incremental progress. I think that incremental progress, whether it's specifically with ADL on hate speech and on tolerance, or in the post-Abraham Accords world where everything is above board, everything is happening in broad daylight, the people of the UAE and the people of Israel are going to be suddenly allowed to trade, to invest, to travel, to research, to study without any political limitations. I think that is huge for our part of the world. Mm-hmm. There are always going to be critics. There are always going to be people who, second guess the decision, but that's normal. It's okay. What I think why I think this is going to be very productive and very positive, I think there's going to be an entire generation of young Emiratis and young Israelis who are going to grow up thinking it's absolutely normal to do this. Mm-hmm. My 10-year-old son is not going to have a very visible memory of a time where the UAE and Israel did not speak to each other. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important for two countries that are not just dynamic economically or technologically. I think both countries spend a lot of time thinking about their future. And if you are looking at the younger generation and how to teach them and how to make them understand tolerance, inclusion, respect, this is a huge deal. And I think it is going to alter, like we said, it's going to alter the way people think about stability in the Middle East for a very long time.
Hear, hear, bravo. I believe you're right. So, maybe to get us started here today, and I'll ask some questions to get the conversation going. And then we've got a lot of people who are on with us, so I know have many things that they want to ask as well. And people, I would encourage you, if you're listening and watching, put your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to them when we can when we open this up. Yeah. But let's just start out, Mr. Ambassador, can you provide some insights into the groundbreaking op-ed that you wrote in the Israeli press that was earlier this summer, it was in June, that appealed directly to the Israeli people regarding normalization and this proposed annexation in the West Bank? Like, what led to the move? I'm curious to help us understand how that came together for you. It was really quite precedent setting. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of that.
I can, but on the condition that you continue to call me Yusuf, the way you normally call me Yusuf.
Okay, that's fine.
All right. So we decided that annexation was going to be catastrophic, not just for us in the region. I thought it was going to be disastrous for Israel. I thought it was going to be very difficult for the United States. I thought Jordan, which is already under tremendous pressure economically, I think they were going to be in a very tough spot. So there was no upside for annexation. We were trying to find a way to prevent annexation. So I have been pressing my leadership into speaking directly to Israel and say, the route you're going is going to make it harder for all of us. I remember you and I had a very long conversation once after a judo tournament was held in the UAE. Israeli athlete won something, but the anthem wasn't played. And we had a very tough conversation about that incident. The year after, the same tournament, the exact same tournament, another athlete won, anthem was played, flag was raised. So there was a trend of more public, more open, more accepting of Israelis in a variety of places, from whether it's judo or jiu-jitsu tournaments or a pavilion at Expo 2020. Annexation was going to harm that. Annexation was going to put that in reverse. So when I kept pestering my leadership and saying, you need to convey this message, they need to understand what the consequences of annexation are. I remember my foreign minister calling me very early one morning. Again, after weeks of pestering, he said, Yusuf, you've been after me for this for a while. why don't you write something and put it in Israeli media? I said, are you sure? He said, yes. You're the ones who keep telling me that this is important. Okay, you do it. So the idea came from back home. We then drafted the article. We got it to where I think the message was very clear and distilled. Either you choose to normalize or you choose to annex. I don't think you'll be able to do both. So think about this carefully. I called a friend of mine, an Israeli American. I said, here's what we want to do. Here's the article we want to send. And he suggested where to place it. He suggested that it be done in Hebrew as well to reach a broader audience. And so I had a friend of mine here who helped me place it. But the message, as you saw, was very clear. Guys, think about this, because this could have negative repercussions compared to what you are advocating for. The article ran mid-June, and it did exactly what we were hoping it would do, which is it triggered a debate. It didn't cause a decision, but it triggered a debate is, hey, is this the right path? Is this what we really ultimately need to do? And shortly after, I think it was only like 2 weeks after, that we started having serious conversations with the White House about what we were prepared to do if we wanted to prevent annexation. And ultimately, we got to the conclusion that you saw on August 13th, which is trading normalization for assurances of no annexation. And it turned out, and this is the one part I'm really proud of, it was a win-win. No one had to give any concessions.
Right.
No one lost. No one had to go back and say, you know, I had to give something up that I knew you really wanted. A week after the announcement, I think the Times of Israel did a poll, and 80% of Israel was in supportive of normalization. Only 20% was against it. I don't know when the last time you saw a poll where 80% of Israel was in support of one thing, but to me, that was a validation that this was the right decision. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of how it came about. Mm-hmm. In all honesty, the White House was very supportive. They jumped on the idea and they made sure it went through the way it did. And so without White House support, I don't think we would have this deal. But also, and I know some people have recognized this, this was a courageous decision. It was the right decision. I mean, there's no second guessing it, but it was still pretty courageous because it was completely unconventional. It was completely out of the box. We did get criticized for it as we expected from certain areas, but it got far bigger support. You know, Republican, Democrat, evangelicals, Jews, conservative, liberals, everybody thought this was a good idea. So I'm very happy and proud with the outcome, but it does show that you can still produce win-win results in this day and age.
Hear, hear. Well, look, I think it took a degree of, look, it takes courage on both sides, but I do think, you know, that op-ed in an Israeli paper, it may have been just whatever, 500, 600 words, but when you trace the genesis of this relationship and the possibilities of change in the Middle East, I think you will look back on that like Sadat's visit to the Knesset, like as a moment where an Arab leader stood up in front of the Israeli people and said, we want to work with you, we're ready. And I think the Israeli people and Jewish people more generally crave that kind of validation, Yousef. And so I don't want to underscore its importance. And I will use my privilege here to tell the crowd, if you don't know our audience, that you were just named to Time Magazine's 100 most influential people of 2020. And I think that op-ed and your words there really merit your inclusion. So
thank you. Really and now you should all cancel your Time subscription because the quality has clearly gone downhill.
Well, like I want to ask, because people applauded, conservative and liberal and Republican and Democrat and Arab and Israeli and Jews and Muslims. But I do want to ask, like, there was something very interesting in the peace treaty that, you know, there was this commitment that said the parties shall work together to counter extremism, which promotes hatred and division and terrorism and its justifications, including by preventing radicalization and recruitment and combating incitement and discrimination. And I think that was interesting to me because I think there were actually extremists on both ends of the spectrum who might not have been supportive. Talk about why that language was included in the treaty and how you think it'll be translated into action.
It was important because that's what we believe in. This was not a policy debate, whether we want to be conservative or liberal or this way or that way. even before we became very vocal about tolerance and respect and inclusion, we've been working with ADL on curbing hate speech and extremism and radicalization for the better part of a decade. You know that.
Yeah, I do. Right.
We believe in this. We believe in this whether we have a relationship with Israel or whether we don't have a relationship with Israel. And it's honestly frustrating that in some systems, in some cultures, hate speech is condoned. It's allowed. Certain types of hate speech. I find it very strange that the Muslim Brotherhood, the exact same organization as Hamas, is okay, but Hamas is a terrorist organization. They are the same group. They are the same ideology. They have the same agenda. So I don't understand why one is given a pass and the other one is not. And I think this is why it's important for us, and not just with Israel, with any like-minded countries. Hate speech is hate speech. Extremism is extremism. I don't care if it's Muslim, Jewish, or Christian. That's the stuff we need to curb. That's the stuff we need to work on and make sure that's not in our curriculums. That's not in our value system. And I think when we do have the Abrahamic House, which I believe the groundbreaking ceremony should be in the next 3-4 weeks, when we do have an Abrahamic House, it's not just going to be like a sightseeing tour, right? You don't just go by and see, oh, look, these buildings look great. No, there's an educational component to this. You need to understand this is how we want to teach our children. That's why we invited the Pope. This is why we invited the Imam of Al-Azhar to sign that document. It's important we set that course for people to follow.
It's great. Well, that actually leads me to think about a kind of a related point, if you will, about extremism. I think extremism is the enemy of all of us. And I think it's the enemy of not just the UAE and Israel, but America. And I worry a lot about it. But that leads me to think about what, if you could share a little bit with our audience today, something you and I talked a bit about, like what was the role of the US in brokering these accords? And I think, what do you think it also says about the role of the US going forward in the region?
So there's been a long debate for the past 10, 12 years about what the US role in the world and specifically in the Middle East should be. And you know what? That's a healthy debate. It's a debate that needs to happen. There are valid reasons for having this debate, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. No one's saying that shouldn't be debated. But I think we in Israel and any other country that has worked and partnered and traded and fought wars with America believes in America's role in the world. It believes that America's role in our part of the world provides stability, provides security, provides jobs, provides ideas. And so we're not only in the pro-US camp, we are the cheerleaders of the pro-US camp.
Yeah.
And I believe Israel's in the same place. Again, I'll say it one more time. This deal could not have been done without the White House support. We came to them with the idea. They jumped on it. They got everything done and negotiated. We pulled this ball over the finish line. The actual deliberations for this did not last more than 4 weeks. Really, it was probably one of the quickest agreements of its type ever negotiated. We came to them with very specific set of principles and ideas. They liked them and it moved very fast. So I think the White House demonstrated to a very large crowd of skeptics that US diplomacy is still very critical and the US role in the Middle East and the broader world is still very critical.
It's very interesting because, you know, there's a whole industry, a cottage industry in Washington of kind of longtime, you know, Middle East fans who moved from administration to administration, and they weren't able to get this job done. You know, and President Bush, who was so beloved by Israel, and President Obama, who augured the Arab Spring, and President Clinton. It's fascinating that this White House got it done. Is there something about this White House that you think is different? Well, there's a lot that's different, but I think in the narrow context of this question, that's different than its predecessors that made this possible? Or do you think, you know, again, anyone in that White House could have done this? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Let's take one step back. I think we are in 2020, and 2020 is a completely different time and place and mindset than just 10 years ago. 10 years ago, if we were doing this webinar and you asked me, hey, do you think you could possibly normalize with Israel before there's a Palestinian state? I'd have told you, absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
If you ask me, do you think Saudi Arabia would approve overflight rights for an Israeli aircraft to fly over Riyadh in order to land in Abu Dhabi?
Right.
I said, Jonathan, you must be losing your mind. There's things that are happening, things that are changing, different viewpoints, different ideologies, different ways of thinking that are taking place in the Middle East that no one is paying attention to. So that's why I think we are where we are. There are changes and different attitudes that are taking hold. The White House, I think with this White House, we got this done very quickly. I think if it was another White House, it probably would have gotten done. It would probably taken a lot longer, taken a lot more process. We would be fighting for weeks over which word to put in which statement. And I think this White House, while it gets a lot of criticism on this issue, is very result-oriented, very focused on the objective, and we got to where we needed to get very quickly.
Well, I think the White House deserves nothing but credit for this. I think it is extraordinary, and I agree with you that their willingness just to roll their sleeves up, get in there and get it done. I don't really care how you vote. If what you value is peace and stability in that region and a long-term future that's equitable for all its people, this is a win, bar none.
The conventional approach to everything, especially in diplomacy, tends to be very risk averse, right? We've always done it this way. We can't try another approach. That's not how we do things, right? And this White House does take risk. And I think the decision from Abu Dhabi to proceed does included a healthy bit of taking risk. But at the end of the day, big risk, big reward. Look where we are today. Look where we are August 13th when the announcement was made. And yes, three leaders had to take a significant amount of risk in order to get this done. Look at what's happening now. Bahrain joined. There are discussions with now several other countries. Some are closer, some are farther. But we did break the ice. We shattered this taboo that you cannot do this with Israel until there's a Palestinian state. And not only did we shatter it, there is a long line of countries now who is looking to do the same thing.
Well, so then let's talk a little bit about that. So, as an organization that's very committed to a two-state solution and believes Israel can't be safe and secure unless Palestinians have an authentic dignity and equity, what does this agreement mean for the Palestinian people in terms of your kind of vision? I know the future can be hard to predict, but help us understand how you believe this advances the cause of Palestinian, the Palestinian cause as well.
Sure. So had there been no normalization and we were having this webinar today with ADL, you and I would have been talking about how much land is going to be annexed. Was it going to be 10%, 15%? And to be honest, when I started having this conversation in the White House, that was actually the debate that was taking place. Is it going to be 10, 13, or 15% that is going to be annexed? So for the Palestinian people, this deal prevented annexation. Let's just make sure that that is a clear understanding. And all that does, it salvages or keeps the two-state solution alive. Because if annexation began, there was going to be no two-state solution. It would have been dead. And so the two states, we've bought time to create space for a two-state solution. But who's ultimately going to negotiate the two-state solution? It's going to be Israel and Palestine. What we did was we put time on the clock. Now, how the parties use that time on the clock to their advantage, that's ultimately their decision. We can't force the two sides to negotiate if they don't want to.
Right.
All I did was create space. So I hope that people take advantage of this opportunity, that they have time to negotiate a two-state solution. But it's hard for us to sort of impose a solution if the parties aren't prepared for it.
Well, I've got to ask, you have the same leadership in Ramallah that you had there for, for well over a decade, getting on 2 decades. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has been in place for a long time too. What's your, as an observer of the region, if you will, and an interested party with a stakeholder in the outcome, what's your take on the ability of these two leaders to actually take advantage of the time on the clock, as you put it?
I wish I could be more optimistic on this question. I think, to be totally honest, I think both are quite okay with the status quo. Mm-hmm. I don't see we were talking earlier about risk taking. I don't see either leader prepared to take risks, the risks necessary to reach a compromise. Each one requires political courage to give up something to his constituency. And I just don't see it in the cards. The only way that happens is if the United States or the UN or the European Union or someone brings the two sides and tries to kind of hold both of their hands and bring them together. Right. But left to each other's devices, I'm not sure either leader is prepared to take that step. Now, obviously, the elections on November 3rd are, going to have an impact. I think a lot of people are waiting to see how those unfold. But I still believe that U.S. leadership is always going to be required to bring the two sides together. Right. But that implies the two sides want to get together. They just need someone to shepherd them. And I think, again, that's something only the U.S. can do.
Yeah, I think your diagnosis is correct. And I think, again, a lot hinges on what happens in November. But as we think about the region itself, I'd love to have you just give us a thought, and then maybe we can move to open it up to the questions that a lot are queuing up in the chat. It's 48 right now. What do you see as some of the greatest challenges that Israel and the UAE can take on together?
Oh, yeah.
We've got certain particular actors, we've got climate, we've got economics. Talk a little bit about what you see as the immediate opportunities in terms of working together to address some of the big challenges.
Yeah, so the low-hanging fruit are the things I already see happening. So COVID research, I think that's already happening. Technology, I don't think there's been a single day since August 13th where some Israeli company has introduced itself to us through some mutual friend or someone that works with them here, where they want to get into the UAE, or an Emirati company that wants to go to Israel. There's so much demand on the business side that this is going to happen organically, so I'm not worried about it. But the areas where I think there's going to be win-win solutions are going to be technology, desalination, agriculture, climate, AI, COVID research. Like I was telling you before the session started, a very famous businessman from Dubai just signed an agreement with a self-driving car company in Israel that got signed yesterday. So these things are already happening. I think that's where sort of gravity is going to pull people. There's technology companies, there's venture capital investment firms. There's a lot of interest in getting to know each other from a business point of view. But the part that I'm most excited about is we really, young Emiratis don't know much about Israel, right? And I don't think Israelis know much about us. So the one part I think is going to be fun is we are going to actually get to know each other. We're going to get to know each other's cultures, our values, our histories, how we deal with our families and kids, and how we're dealing with quarantines. And there's this sort of, uncharted territory for two very interesting societies that haven't really been able to connect yet. To me, that's the fun part.
That's super neat. So let me ask one final question, then we'll move it to the chat. I do want to ask, I think one of the loudest opponents of this agreement, and I think one of the countries that poses the most significant challenge in the region is Iran. And Iran has been fairly outspoken in a way, honestly, that's kind of unsurprising. Give us a little bit of the view from the UAE of Iran and how you think, I think I know, but I'd still like to hear you articulate it, and how Israel and the UAE and other interested parties can work together to confront the challenge that it poses.
So, whether it's Iran or Turkey or any other country that promotes an ideology or that mantle is an ideology or a religion, I think the UAE approach is, first of all, it's not targeting Iran or Turkey or any country by name or leader. What we've adopted is, and I get in trouble for saying this particular word, so I'm going to find an alternative, is a civil form of governing, where we separate religion from governance, where we don't look to the Quran to derive what we think our energy policy should be, or our infrastructure system should be, or, how are we going to, create jobs? We don't look for ideological sermons for this. And so I think the group of countries that believes they are forward-looking, that believes that we need to keep faith as a personal issue, are the countries who seem to be doing well for each other. Iran and Turkey, unfortunately, I think have become addicted to promoting ideology over solutions. And maybe that's what their people want. I personally don't think that's the way forward. I don't think that the economic model in Iran has really delivered for the people. But that's not for me to say. I think our model works for us. And I think the Israeli model works for Israel. Now, if we can get those two models to work together to promote what's inside our borders for our people, for our society, all we can do is set the right example.
Yeah.
I've not heard anyone ever tell me, yeah, the Iranian economic model, that's fantastic. We should try to do that in our country.
Right. Yeah, I hear that. Okay. Yeah, we've got, again, a lot of questions in the chat. Do we want to open it up? Or do you want to kind of help bring some of those into this discussion with you?
Absolutely, and we have all sorts of things that are populating. I'm going to try and group some of these topics into one question because we're getting a lot along the same themes. There's actually, interestingly, been a lot of question about how you envision the tourism changing to the UAE as a result of this, and if you're prepared to accommodate that and really what that looks like moving forward.
So first, we're definitely prepared. I think COVID has really put a damper on, our tourism industry. Last year, before COVID, tourism was 11% of GDP in the UAE, 11%. So for you, just to put it into context, that's the equivalent of 1 million barrels per day that we produce. We produce a little over 3 million barrels a day. Tourism is like a third of that. So we desperately need it because of COVID. And so I think it's going to be welcome. And if there was ever a news story that created almost as much attention as the signing or as the announcement, it was the introduction of kosher food in all hotels in the UAE. I don't know if you saw this, but the day that was announced, the spike in stories about serving kosher food in the UAE was pretty impressive. So I think that indicates that we're ready.
I would say so. I wish I could say I was surprised, but to me that just feels like the natural next question.
Yeah.
So another question, does the Abraham Accord provide a window of opportunity to promote positive interfaith awareness and cooperation, including education about the Jewish people, their religion, and their history? I know you touched on this earlier, and multiple people cited it as a source of inspiration that the children today don't know what this relationship should be and what an opportunity that is. But perhaps you can speak a little bit more to that.
Absolutely. And this was already happening. I think the Abraham Accords puts a spotlight on it and allows people to see things that we were already doing but weren't paying attention to it because, we didn't have a relationship with Israel. Now that we have a relationship with Israel, focus on Judaism is going to be higher. But that's great because we were already doing it. When the Pope came to visit, that was 1.5 years ago. We weren't even talking about normalization with Israel. When we decided to build the Abrahamic house, that was 1 year ago. So that stuff was ongoing. I think the Abraham Accord allows us to then put more focus and attention on things that we were already doing before that nobody noticed.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Another question that's getting a lot of attention, can you speak to which Arab nations do you feel are the most likely to establish relations with Israel?
Yeah, so that's the question I get by far the most. and listen, I strongly believe that a foreign diplomat shouldn't really be speaking about other countries and their policies and their views just because it's not my place. And just like I wouldn't want another ambassador, talking about UAE policy. But I do know for a fact that there are other countries who are considering doing what we just did. They have to do it on their own time. They have to do it based on their own domestic politics and public opinion. They have to do it based on their national interest. But I do know that we took away the mirage of that this can't be done. We just demonstrated that it can be done, and it can be done in a win-win way. So there are some countries that are, I think, very close. And by very close, I mean, if everything goes well within the next few days, if possible. I don't want to out them. It's let them make their decisions on their time. But yes, I think you're going to see more of this. But they have to occur at a time based on their country's preparedness. Each one has to have their own political will and be able to make this decision on their own time.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just inspirational and amazing to hear that regardless. Now, I love this question. Why the name the Abraham Accord?
So I know the person who came up with the name, and I will give him full credit for coming up with this. His name is Miguel Correa. He is the Gulf Director at the National Security Council. He's a 2-star general from the Special Forces in the U.S. Army. His last job was, he was the U.S. military attaché in Abu Dhabi until very recently. He has been instrumental in getting this accord done. And when we were all looking for a name, he popped up and he said, hey, I have an idea. The Abraham Accords. Yusuf, what do you think? I was like, this is perfect. Like, you couldn't come up with a better name. We were trying to think of something about the future or something about, you know, the horizon, something technical. And he kind of came up with something that blew everything we were thinking about out of the water. So big shout out to Miguel Correa. He came up with this. He deserves the credit.
I like that. And I like that you credited him so specifically. I'm sure he'll appreciate the shout out.
Yeah, no, you got to give credit where credit's due.
So another question. My understanding is that a component of the peace deal is the U.S. supplying fighter jets to the UAE. What's the status of this component of the deal? And why is that important to your country?
Okay, so just a correction, it's not a contingent or a component of the deal.
Okay.
It's not. We've been trying to buy F-35s for the past 6 years. And just ask General Mattis how long this has been going on. One other thing that we were looking at, that we talked about with the United States, something we were trying to acquire since George W. Bush was in office. And so there are certain defense requirements that we have been trying to get for a very long time that unfortunately have not been released, primarily because of QME. So QME was an obstacle. Now that we are not a threat to Israel, now that we have normalized with Israel, now that we are a trading partner and investment partner with Israel, we are going to, well, the United States and Israel will look at QME in a different light. And that's a decision for those two countries. What does and what doesn't constitute a qualitative military edge to Israel. Are we going to continue to try to acquire US military hardware? Yes, we are. Was this part of the deal? No, it wasn't. But this deal does provide a better landscape and the conditions for an improved approval process for the things that we've been trying to get for a long period of time. So we are talking with the United States right now about all of those things. We still haven't concluded, but it was not, the deal was not contingent on this.
Thank you.
Deb, I want to ask a question to you.
Please.
You know, as we talk about, there's so many winners for this deal, right? I think the UAE benefits, I think the Gulf benefits, I think Israel benefits. I definitely think the Palestinian people benefit. I think America benefits. But I'm curious as to your take on what this means for one of the kind of superpowers who's gotten back involved in the region in the last sort of decade, which is Russia. So Russia really, you know, by dint of its intervention in Syria and its having forces on the ground, has really played a much bigger role in the Middle East than it had in decades, certainly since the end of the Cold War. I wonder, what does this deal mean for them? And do you think that it encourages them to engage more closely with Turkey or more closely with Iran? Or how do you think this plays out for Russia?
That's a good question. I honestly haven't spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think, in my humble analysis, I think Russia sometimes does things for very strategic reasons, and sometimes they do things just to mess with the United States. Mm-hmm. And so how they react to this, I honestly don't know. I'm not sure yet. As countries make decisions like this that puts them further into the US orbit, I'm sure that it would be irritating. Mm-hmm. But the Russians are very clever and they move very well. They're not politically polarized. They don't have to deal with congressional issues. They don't have to deal with media issues. So if the Russian leadership decides they want to do something, they simply do it. And in that sense, they're actually more effective and efficient. But I don't know if they're going to have a fundamental reaction to this. They will keep trying to sell weapons to countries in the region, but I think if we are able to get our military requirements from the United States, that disadvantages countries like Russia and China in the region. Mm-hmm. We've been trying to do these things with the United States for a very long period of time. And if this works out the way I think it will, it just means that the US team in the region has become stronger.
Good thing. Deb?
Thank you. So much of what you have said is just incredible and groundbreaking. How do you feel this accord empowers other religious minority groups in the regions, especially Christians who've been under great stress?
This agreement definitely helps, but what I think helps more is leadership in countries that adopt and support and protect those minorities. So, for example, the West is very critical of, let's say, President Sisi of Egypt. But you know who loves President Sisi of Egypt? All the Coptic Christians in Egypt. Mm. They feel that Sisi really looks out for them, protects them, and looks after them.
Yeah.
So, sure, is he, the world's most democratic leader? I'm sure the West doesn't think so, and the Washington Post doesn't think so. But think about it from the perspective of those minorities that you're asking me about. I think the Accords definitely give them moral support and a moral boost. But it really comes down to the leaders of the countries where those minorities actually live, where they practice. Just ask yourself about the minorities that live in Iran, the Sunnis and the Baluch and the Azeris that live in Iran. The Sunni population is actually quite significant in Iran. You know how many Sunni mosques there are in Iran? Zero. They don't have a single mosque. And so I would just, my answer would be, it depends more on the leaderships and the governances in those countries.
Thank you. It's been an open secret that Israel and the UAE have had contact for years. And for example, we saw one Israeli diplomat at the signing, proud to finally be able to talk about his longtime friendship with you. Yeah. Can you tell us about some of the back channel relations, how you've engaged, maybe any anecdotes from over the years?
So the friend that you're referring to is a really good friend of mine. His name is Jeremy Isaacaroff, and he's the current Israeli ambassador to Germany. And I've known him probably 15, 16 years. I met him through a mutual friend many, many years ago. When I came to Washington in 2008, he was the DCM here. So he was one of the people I already knew. So, we've always kept in touch, but there's always this mystique that these are, secret backroom, very underhanded relationships. And in reality, like, I would meet Jeremy for breakfast, or we meet for a coffee somewhere in public. This wasn't some kind of covert, undercover relationship. At least not as far as I'm concerned. We would talk, we would have things that we had agreed on. We have things that we don't agree on. We talk about our kids. We talk about our posts. We talk about, like, how are you finding this issue or that issue? There's this notion that because we have a relationship with Israel now, we're going to agree on everything. And you can't think of two countries where that's real. You're going to have disagreements. We're going to have tough conversations about the Palestinian issue and about two-state solution. But we're also going to have very positive conversations about trade and investment and AI and technology. I mean, that's the nature of any relationship, whether it's two countries or whether it's a marriage or a friendship. You hope that the relationship has more assets than liabilities, and I'm sure that's going to be the case. But there's nothing sinister about this. There's nothing that ultimately led to this solution. If you want to give credit to what caused this, it was the annexation debate. If it wasn't for the annexation debate, this wouldn't have happened, at least not now.
I need to say something. So we share our friendship with Jeremy, who's now the ambassador to Germany, and what you might not know, Yousef, is that his wife, Laura Cam, worked for ADL for like 10 years. She worked for him. She worked at ADL in our DC office when he was stationed there. And then she worked in our Jerusalem office for a long time.
I did not know that. I've known him for a very long time, and I did not know that.
So there's more ADL connections. So which is funny. So I want to ask you a little bit about Saudi. So, you know, we've seen different reports in the US media about the king and the crown prince and their perspective on this. We've certainly heard from many that Saudi had to be somewhat in the know for this to happen because of their kind of outsized role in the region. Talk to us a little bit about Saudi behind the scenes and what you think this means going forward, if you can.
So Saudi is a very important country in our part of the world. It's also a very misunderstood country. There's a lot of media. There's a lot of speculation. The piece you're referring to is the Wall Street Journal piece that talks about, oh, well, the crown prince found out, he didn't tell his father, and his father was... Here's my humble view. Most Western reporters do not have any idea what's going on inside the royal family in Saudi Arabia. So I would not put a lot of stock into it. Mm-hmm. The few people that actually know what's happening don't talk to reporters, and they certainly don't talk to Western reporters. Mm-hmm. That's a very, very sort of private, discreet world. So when an expert from so-and-so think tank writes, oh, they are furious with, yeah, it's usually not true. It's usually not true. Mm-hmm. The two countries for us that are most important are Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Saudi Arabia because of Mecca and Medina, Egypt because of Al-Azhar University. Because those two countries, if they are not stable, if they are not moderate, you and I are going to have a very difficult job. Because if you want to curb hate speech and extremist ideology, you know, just imagine what would happen if those two countries were promoting, you know, what Al Jazeera promotes. So their importance to us is about their weight and gravity and their status in the Middle East and their status in terms of Islam. There's only one country, and I don't want to, you know, get into too many details, that was given a heads up just a little bit before, and for the obvious reasons. I spoke to King of Jordan's office about 48 hours before, gave him a heads up that this was coming, because I think the one country that is most impacted by annexation was going to be Jordan. And the relationship between us and Jordan is very important, and it's very strong. So I think they were given, you know, like a 48-hour heads up. But the vast majority of countries were either just informed when the announcement happened or were given a courtesy heads up just hours before. This was a sovereign UAE decision that we made on our own, for our own reasons, in conjunction with the United States. So the idea that, you know, countries were consulted is not valid.
Got it. Well, let me ask you one last question then on a related note, and mentioning Egypt and Jordan, who have, you know, both have significant strategic importance in the region. They also have very large populations that we know is not very inclined toward Israel. And we know from our own analysis at ADL and the kind of the sentiment analyses that we do, there are very high degrees of anti-Semitism in those countries, and they do not seem to be enthusiastic about people-to-people peace like I would say the people of the UAE. What is it going to take? What is it going to take to broker that people-to-people exchange between Israel, Egypt, and Jordan? How do we change the dynamic that's at play right now in those countries?
So it's going to take courage, and it's going to take a new, younger mindset that is not sort of held hostage to the past. I think the advantage that we in Bahrain have, to be frank, is, you know, we haven't had any wars with Israel. We don't share a border. We're not focused on refugees and, you know, what the Israelis and the Palestinians negotiate in terms of their borders. That's not an issue for us. We see more upside. Most of our population is too young to remember the 1973 war. Like, they didn't live through that. But in Egypt and Jordan, that's not the case. So I think it's important to distinguish between why this is going to be a warm peace and why Jordan and Egypt have a cold peace. I mean, I think it's just a question of demographics, geography, and mindset, right? I think young Emiratis are actually really excited to see Israel. They're excited to see young Israelis that they don't, other than a disagreement on Palestine, they really don't have any issues with. And so I think that's why the UAE and Bahrain thing is slightly different in terms of how they look at Israel versus Egypt and Jordan.
We have a long way to go there. Deb, do you want to bring in any last questions in the time remaining?
Yeah, absolutely. We've gotten multiple questions about the Jewish community in the Emirates. We know you were able to wish them a Shana Tova, a happy Jewish New Year, which is, it's just an incredible thing. And it sort of expressed how important that community is within the UAE. And that tolerance and inclusion and acceptance are a central part of how the Emirates pushes back against violent extremism. It's a remarkable contrast with how many states in the region accept or even propagate anti-Semitism as a survival tactic. When and why did the UAE choose a different path? And would it be going too far to say that philo-Semitism and other forms of tolerance are becoming part of the UAE's national security strategy?
It's not part of our national security strategy. It's more part of who we are. So I'll tell you a story and sort of lead into why we've chosen to be more vocal about tolerance, inclusion, and respect. A few years before Sheikh Zayed passed away, so I don't quote me on the date, but probably in the early 2000s, Sheikh Zayed was on a visit to Switzerland, and he was going for a walk near the hotel he was staying in, and there were a bunch of shops, and he was looking at the shops. He got to one shop, and the owner of the shop quickly came out of the store to greet him outside of the store before he walked in. And he said, Sheikh Zayed, it's very nice to meet you. It's an honor, da, da, da. And Sheikh Zayed, this is Sheikh Mohammed telling me the story. So he said, Sheikh Zayed felt he was being rushed. Like the owner didn't want him to go into the store. And he was very politely trying to move the president of the UAE away from his store. So he found that kind of strange. So he said, I want to come into your store. Sheikh Zayed said, the owner said, I don't think that's a good idea, sir. He's like, why not? He leaned over and whispered in his ear. He said, Your Highness, I'm Jewish, and I don't want you to have your picture taken with me or something, or cause you any embarrassment. It would be awkward.
Oh.
Sheikh Zayed said, You're Jewish? He said, yeah. And at the time, Sheikh Zayed was walking with a cane. So he took a cane out and he said, get out of the way, and walked right into his store. Proceeded to sit in the store for like half an hour and talk to his owner about the relationship between Prophet Muhammad and his Jewish neighbors. And he sat in the store for half an hour talking about the relationship between Muslims and Jews. And this was in the 2000s. It leads me to answer the second part of your question, which is, why are we doing this? These are our values. This is what we believe in. This is the DNA we inherited. And the reason we're being more vocal about it is we feel that our values are being hijacked. Our religion is being hijacked. Extremists have taken over Islam and claimed it as their own, whether it's bin Laden or Baghdadi or God knows who else. This is not the Islam that we grew up with. This is not what we were taught. This is not how we were raised. We were raised that, you respect your elders, you try to be faithful, you try to be decent, you try to be respectful. You don't exclude others who disagree with you, and you certainly don't harm them. Okay, if you disagree with them, that's different than harming them and killing them, than inflicting harm. And I think it's really important that people understand this is who we are as a country. And the reason we adopted a year of tolerance, invited the Pope, or building an Abrahamic house is because we feel that Islam has been misrepresented by a very small minority, but a very crazy minority. And we need to do this because it's good for us and for how people see us. So it's a long answer to your question, but it's always been who we are. We just feel that we have to be more vocal and more public about it.
I think it's a moving answer and a wonderful answer. And I think it's an appropriate way, if I might, to conclude what's been an incredibly rich and I think energizing conversation. I know that there are a lot of reasons in this world right now with things playing out on the streets or in society or on social media to feel down. And I think you've somehow managed to lift all of us up. With your words today, I think with your actions over the past several months and years behind the scenes, and really with the vision you've laid out, which is one I think that everyone in our organization, in our community, in the country, around the world, I think everyone can get behind. So Yusuf, thank you so much for sharing with us today and for being, I think, just so important and so courageous. We really, really need more of that in the world.
Jonathan, thank you for your friendship and thank you for the relationship that we've had with ADL over the years. I know it was always strong. I think in light of the Abraham Accords is going to get even stronger. Thank you for always being there. And thank you for everyone on your team for having me today.
Inshallah, we will do much more together.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Deb?
Thank you both for an extraordinary conversation. I can't count how many times I had chills. It's just an unbelievable moment in time. So thank you both for talking so beautifully about it. I want to thank everybody on the line for joining us today. And to answer the question, this was recorded, and keep an eye on your inbox because we will be sending out that link so you'll be able to access it and send it to whomever you'd like. With that, I would like to again wish those who are celebrating a Shana Tova and those who are observing a Gemar Chatima Tova, and wish you well until next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.